welcome to coverage of U.S. Nationals Round 4. Maria Bartholdi in the booth, joined by the one and only Reed Duke. Hans Buckner there on the left side of your screen, playing Steel Leaf Stompy versus the 16th ranked player in the world, Brian Braun-Duin, on white-blue control. Okay, Reed, there's something interesting about his particular build of this control deck. What is it?
Well, Brian has no ways to deal damage in his entire main deck. Not only that, but he doesn't have Approach of the Second Sun either, so he is fully committed to decking the opponent with the -3 Teferi on itself trick. So the way Brian's hoping for this to play out is that he takes control of the game, uses a board sweeper like Settle the Wreckage or Fumigate to stabilize the board, and ticks Teferi up to 8 loyalty. Once he gets the Teferi emblem, it's sort of academic from there. He can win at his convenience. Generally, I guess you and I will hope via concession from the opponent. But if he needs to, if the opponent insists on playing it out, he can start putting Teferi in his own library, burying it so that he never runs out of cards. But eventually, after 53 turns, Hans Buckner will run out of cards if Brian's able to assemble that game plan.
Oh boy. Okay, so I was caught in the midst of a control matchup last weekend. This one, however, not exactly the same. Steel Leaf Stompy is pretty capable of getting the job done quickly if it can get under some of BBD's counter spells.
Yes, these are two very different decks going at one another. I think this is a matchup that Brian Braun-Duin is going to be happy with. The heavy green deck is sort of one-dimensional. All it can really do is play and attack with creatures, which is great if you're packing your deck full of Settle the Wreckage and Fumigate. That said, don't count the Steel Leaf Stompy deck out, because its creatures do hit very hard. It only takes Brian Braun-Duin missing one beat somewhere along the way before a 5-power creature like a Steel Leaf Champion or a Ronus or even a Heart of Kirin will do him in.
Cast Out here is going to deal with the Heart of Kirin that was on the table, leaving Ronus alone on the battlefield for Hans Buckner.
And this is something that you'll see players try to take advantage of against Steel Leaf Stompy once in a while, is Heart of Kirin and Ronus. While super powerful cards, they don't really do much when they're stranded by themselves. If they don't have teammates, so to speak, they just sit there and can't attack. So Brian tactically allowing the Ronus to get onto the battlefield, and he's probably going to pick his fights over the follow-up creatures, and if he can keep anything off the battlefield, exhaust Hans of threats, then Brian is completely safe with or without the Ronus.
Essence Scatter there found after cycling a Censor was going to take care of that Thrashing Brontodon, but Hans has another one at the ready here. Resilient Kenra, the follow-up as well, allowing Ronus to get in.
Looked like Hans was about to crew his Ronus there, but no need for that.
Nobody needs to drive Ronus. This snake can drive itself. Seal Away, however, is going to get it, and here is a Fumigate from Brian Braun-Duin.
And a perfect sequence from Brian. It worked out very poorly for Hans that he didn't have another land to keep one open for Thrashing Brontodon, so he's going to lose both his creatures, and here he's in the same situation he was a moment ago, where he's got a super powerful card on the battlefield, but it's inadequate if it doesn't have anything to crew.
All right, so the flagship in play for Hans, pass back from Brian Braun-Duin, who's down to, I believe, just one card in hand. So it could be that Hans has been able to, if he's able to stick a creature here, well, I might have spoken too soon. That's a Heart of Kirin. And we're not going to be able to turduck in this one yet until we have a creature in play.
He does have the Resilient Kenra in his graveyard, so that means even a land is going to help him out.
All right, Scrap Heap Scrounger, how about that?
And it's an interesting question of what's going on Brian's side of the battlefield. He navigated the early turns of the game exactly how his blue-white control wants to, neutralizing the opponent's threats, getting to a late-game situation where he's at 21 life with plenty of mana. But there's one step left after that.
Here's Ghalta!
Yeah, there's Ghalta. The remaining step for Brian is he's got to have one of those cards to refill his hand, like a Teferi or a pull from tomorrow.
How about this Fumigate?
It's good. He's got more defense, but it doesn't deal with the vehicles, and you got to figure Hans is going to draw either a creature or a land, and a land lets him return either Resilient Kenra or Scrap Heap Scrounger from the graveyard.
All right, sure enough, a black source right on time here for Hans Buckner, who's going to return that Scrap Heap Scrounger and send a Brontodon into exile, and we'll be able to jump into that Heart of Kirin. Or the Skyship. Boom! Smashes in with the Skyship. Brian Braun down to 13 life to Hans Buckner's 20. There's a look at the Sky Sovereign itself.
Brian is very reliant on drawing Teferi or Pull from Tomorrow in this particular case. Search for Azcanta would do a lot of great work in a game like this, but the window's closing on something like that. He doesn't have too many more turns to go here.
Yeah, and this is just a case of, sometimes a creature deck can feel kind of helpless playing against a white-blue control deck. Fumigate. We've survived 2 Fumigates here for Hans. And now we're going to be able to bring back this Resilient Kenra and add more power to the table. And he's just been able to basically stomp his way through.
Definitely very impressive from the Steel Leaf Stompy deck, being able to fight through all of this removal. But I'll say it again, there's just a piece missing for Brian. He's done a lot of what he needs to do to win this game. Oh, wow. So he found Pull.
All right.
But he's in a situation where he can't dump all his mana into it right away because he needs to find something if he's going to survive the turn.
Let's see what he was able to find off that Pull from Tomorrow. Pitches a land.
He elected to tap 6 mana, leaving 2 open, so he could draw Blink of an Eye or Seal Away. He could have done it for only 3 and then maybe found Disallow for the Kenra. He could have done it for only 2 and then found Settle the Wreckage. So a lot of options available to Brian, but I like the way he's chosen to balance things because he does need to worry about winning the game in the long run. If he draws only 2 or 3 cards, he might not have enough gas. So he needs to parlay finding an answer and restocking his hand to continue fighting in the long game. And I think he made the best decision he could there in tapping 6 mana for the Pull.
Well, luckily enough, he was able to find that Blink of an Eye, sending the Heart of Kirin back to Hans Buckner's hand. Drops down to 7 life, and here's a search for Azcanta.
That's going to be very good if Brian can survive 2 or 3 more turns, but that's a big if with so much power and toughness on Hans' side of the battlefield.
This game has turned out to be remarkably close thanks to that Pull from Tomorrow. Scrounger getting in the flagship Resilient Kenra, hitting the red zone too, and there it is. Settle the Wreckage from BBD.
Wow, so Brian's going to come back and win this game despite how bad it looked a moment ago. That Pull from Tomorrow was not a moment too soon. And Brian navigated it well, found the cards he needed, and now I think he's going to take over the game with Search for Azcanta.
Wow. He was really up against it just a turn ago. Being able to find that Blink of an Eye and that Settle the Wreckage, incredibly key here in pulling him back from the brink. Heart of Kirin hits the table once again for Hans and has to pass the turn back over. And like you said, that Search for Azcanta now is just going to take things over. It's going to flip.
Yep, so it clears the top of his library, transforms right away. Brian has a wealth of mana, which means he can use the Azcanta and cast whatever he finds in the same turn, probably. He may also choose to just pass with all his mana open, which makes it always really tough on the aggro player. How much do you attack with? You cast your spell pre or post combat. Your opponent can really do anything.
Right, and we saw that last turn too. 2 cards in hand for BBD after that Pull from Tomorrow, and we saw kind of a swing in with both of Hans's available creatures. And what are the chances that they have Settled the Wreckage? Oh, sure enough, there it is. All right, so we're going to have Heart of Kirin hitting the red zone here. Commit is the card from Brian Braun. Put that back into Hans's library. How about another one?
A really nice answer from Brian. And I'm actually curious. We can't hear what the players are saying, but I wouldn't be surprised if Brian had actually done that in response to the crew in order to play around Ghalta, Primal Hunger.
Oh, sure. There's Teferi.
And Teferi should be just about the nail in the coffin. Hans is going to have a 1, maybe 2-turn window to deal that last 7 points of damage, or else this game is going to be over, because Brian's going to assemble that super powerful combo of Azcanta the Sunken Ruin with Teferi, potentially being able to dig 8 cards into his library every single turn, not to mention drawing an extra card from Teferi. And when the game gets to that point against blue-white control, the green creature deck it's just hopeless to keep up.
8 cards into your library every turn.
Yeah, I guess technically you see 10, right? 1 from your draw step, 1 from Teferi,
Yeah.
2 activations of Azcanta.
Wow. Okay, so here's Teferi plus.
Hey, that's a cool one from Brian, Arch of Erazka.
All right.
It's almost like Azcanta Jr. here.
And of course, we do have the City's Blessing as well. Right away. Arch of Erazka, you can pay 5 to tap to draw a card. There it is on screen for you. This isn't a card we always see in these decks, is it?
No, it's very slow, and with no creatures in the deck, the blue-white control players usually don't have all that much outside of lands, but as we can see, these games do go super long. Seal Away and Cast Out do contribute an extra permanent. And particularly in something like a control mirror, where neither player ever wants to tap their mana to actually put a spell onto the stack, just sitting around and drawing an extra card here and there from the Arch can definitely make a difference.
Disallow here will deal with Gulta number 2 that's tried to stick here for Hans. Heart of Kirin getting in for 4 here, and that's good.
Nicely played by Hans. He cast the Gulta before attacking, just in case there was something like a Settle the Wreckage to reduce his amount of power and toughness on the battlefield.
BBD going to fall to 3 here, and there's a Settle that he's able to find.
Wow, so I got to wonder if Brian actually could have died that turn had Hans had an additional creature to crew the Heart and send in the Scrap Heap Scrounger too. I think that was the last window for Hans, but now with the revealed Settle the Wreckage, with the Steel Leaf Stompy deck not really having any direct damage, yet not even Walking Ballista in this particular list, I just don't think he's going to be able to cross the finish line here. He got close.
Much closer than I would have anticipated.
Definitely, you said it, fighting through those 2 Fumigates with a mono-green creature deck, really impressive. I talked about the downside of Heart of Kirin, Sky Sovereign, and Ronus, that they can get stranded on their own. But of course, the upside is that they're resilient to Fumigate and any sorcery speed removal for that matter. And just, man, do they hit hard.
And here's Settle the Wreckage on that Heart of Kirin's got to basically fire it off. Still 4 cards left in hand for BBD, though. And another Heart of Kirin for Hans Buckner here. They just don't stop coming. A whole fleet.
That's a funny thing when you get to this super late stage and your opponent has a legendary card in play. You're kind of like, oh, well, I could kill it, but chances are that they're just holding 1 or 2 more.
All right, so pretty full grip here for Brian. Down the stretch. Teferi at 6. Arch of Erazka in play. A flipped Search for Azcanta to Azcanta the Sunken Ruin. We're going to tick up to 7, draw another card. And as the green player, Reed, I know you're kind of a proponent, as they say, of playing it out. If you're in his seat in this situation, what do you do?
Well, I mean, I will say Brian is at 3 life, which means there is still the hope that I'll just sneak in 1 more attack before the shields are completely up. So I don't think it's time to concede just yet. Maybe once the Teferi goes ultimate, you can start thinking about it. But another thing is, even once you have given up hope of winning the game, you have to start thinking about what the round clock is going to mean. You know, how bad or good is a draw for me? Is there any way that I can leave enough time for my faster deck to win, but not enough time for Brian's slower deck to win? These are questions that you could be asking yourself. Generally speaking, though, if it's game 1 and you know you're going to lose, you don't want to overthink it. You probably just want to leave enough time to win the next 2 games.
All right, so there's another pull from tomorrow added to the party here for Brian. Draw a card off of Teferi.
Yeah, and I caught a quick glimpse of his hand. He's got a cast out, a Settle the Wreckage. So Hans is never dealing combat damage again in this game. It should be fairly academic from here.
Yeah, disallow. So let's talk a little bit about the choice that Brian has made to bring this win conditionless version, quote unquote, of white-blue control versus something like you mentioned earlier that has approach in it, or even one single Gideon in the main, which he doesn't even have.
Well, I would describe it as masochism. Brian is setting himself up for a long weekend.
Oh,
but
yes.
He's the type that really enjoys these drawn-out games. He likes to play Magic. He likes to play Control. You see him with Miracles in Legacy, sometimes Piloting Control or Lantern decks in Modern, and of course Blue-White here in Standard. This is where he feels comfortable. He's really good at navigating these long game situations, the long-term planning, the defensive style of play. So this is right in Brian's wheelhouse, and if there's anyone who can put up a great finish with a deck like this and navigate to winning games in time, it's him.
Okay, so why not put another Teferi to join the Teferi emblem that we have, so things could start getting nasty here very quickly with that emblem in play. Last weekend, I'm not 100% sure if he ended up doing it, but he did tweet that he was trying to beat Chain Whirler and he couldn't, so he said he was just going to join him. Now playing white-blue control, kind of the opposite.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a case of I had a bad experience with red, so let me play the most polar opposite deck I can possibly think of.
Steel Leaf Champion here for Hans. That's not going to see the light of day. Ooh. Is this going to be a giant pull from tomorrow? Exile everything?
Oh, wow.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
So 8 permanents gone with the Teferi emblem.
Yes. I'm not a control player, but this is sweet.
So you see Brian there. He finishes resolving the spell. Then his triggers go on the stack. Better than a Emrakul the Aeon Torns hit.
And Hans Buchner sees the very obvious writing on the wall there and scoops up his permanents, giving game 1 to Brian Braun-Duin. And white-blue control over Steel Leaf Stompy. All right, so what tools does Hans Buchner have in his sideboard, do you think, Reed, to be able to deal with a deck like Brian's?
So there's 2 questions that should be going through Hans's mind right now. The first is, how do I improve my deck against what Brian just did to me? The particular offenders are Fumigate and Settle the Wreckage. Those are the real danger cards for a green creature deck. But equally important, perhaps more important, the second question that Hans should be asking himself is, what am I going to do against what Brian's preparing for me in the sideboarded games?
Right.
Which means, even though he had no creatures in game 1, you don't want to be caught off guard by something like Lyra Dawnbringer. So a card that I would really be looking to if I'm Hans is Crushing Canopy. That's 3 mana to destroy either an enchantment or a creature with flying. So you could see, even in that first game there, that would have been pretty helpful to cast out or seal away, free up one of his best cards, but also gives you built-in insurance against Lyra. He's also got some non-creature threats like Nissa, Vital Force, Vraska, Relic Seeker. I think those are slam dunks to come in because they do allow him to navigate in a close game through Settle the Wreckage and Fumigate.
Sometimes you'll see the white-blue control lists bring in cards like History of Benalia, too. Is that something Brian Braun-Duin has access to?
He does have access to it. He has it in his sideboard. If I know Brian, I think he will not bring in History of Benalia for this particular matchup. I think he very well could bring in Lyra Dawnbringer, but Brian is he's pretty content to just play. I mean, he won game 1 there.
Right.
Everything went exactly according to plan. He was able to dismantle his opponent's aggression, so why complicate that? Why would you try to beat down with 2/2s when your game 1 strategy worked so well?
So it looks like Lyra will be able to be enough of a change here that for BBD to be happy with, just adding in that creature. We don't have to mess around with 2/2s anyway. Steel Leaf Stompy is way bigger than 2/2s. They ate those for dinner.
We mentioned no ways to deal damage in the main deck for Brian, but he does have that one of Gideon of the Trials that you sometimes see as a win condition. That's in his sideboard. I think it's actually pretty strong in this matchup because the Steel Leaf Stompy deck is so much about single threats that unload a lot of damage, and Gideon being able to neutralize the best one might work out well.
Yeah, that +1 on Gideon helping to slow down a lot of stuff in matchups more than I played with it a little bit, and more than I even thought that it would. Just completely taking out a 12/12 with just a plus. Pretty sweet.
Right. It's sometimes not the best against the super fast decks like Mono Red, because then they can swarm around it and they can deal some incidental damage with Goblin Chain Whirl or stuff like that, and they can actually kill the Gideon pretty easily, sometimes at a profit. So I think it can be a liability if your opponent is either too fast or too slow, but Hans Buckner with the Steel Leaf Stompy deck is that sweet spot in the middle where the Gideon is going to be an effective removal spell.
Plussing on a Heart of Kirin feels pretty great.
Definitely. And we saw Hans, every time the Heart of Kirin finally died, he played another one from his hand, it being legendary, of course. So imagine if you could actually neutralize it with a removal spell that doesn't take it off the battlefield. That's going to be even better against a legendary permanent like Heart of Kirin.
All right, so players drawing their opening hands here for game number 2. We are in round 4 here. Welcome to coverage of U.S. Nationals if you're just joining us. Maria Bartholdi joined by Reed Duke here in the booth for the standard portion of our tournament, and we are underway. Round 5 coming up next, and then we are going to draft some Dominaria.
I'm excited for that. How about you?
Oh, I'm so pumped. Dominaria draft is so sweet, Reed. All right, so Heart of Kirin kicking things off for Hans Buckner. And Brian Braun-Duin is just going to pass. And there you go. You can see a Nissa hiding out in Hans's hand.
Nissa is a real beating against blue-white control. For starters, it matches up perfectly against Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. There are not that many ways to punish Teferi since he ticks up to 5 loyalty the turn he comes down, so something like a Glorybringer is not even going to do the trick. But Nissa does make a 5-power hasted creature, so if you can line things up right, you can just tag a Teferi the turn he comes down. Alternatively, this is just another non-creature threat that hits super hard, resilient to Settle the Wreckage, resilient to Fumigate. So this is a key card for Hans, but he still has the challenge of sneaking it past Brian's permission.
Disallow here on a Karn from Hans Buckner.
Oh yeah, that's another Planeswalker that we forgot to mention in sideboarding, but that's a nice one for Hans.
Unfortunately not going to see play this game, as it's been disallowed. It was interesting last turn, too. We saw a Seal Away on the Scrap Heap Scrounger that was crewing that Heart of Kirin. And I remember thinking, like, oh, well, Seal Away is not going to be able to get this Heart of Kirin. Well, it'll get what's crewing it. Steel Leaf Champion here for Hans is good. But, yeah, we've got some artifact removal here from Brian Braun-Duin. Down goes Heart of Kirin.
And again, wouldn't be surprised if Brian did that in response to the crew to play around Blossoming Defense. That's a play you want to be savvy about if you ever play this matchup at home.
All right, so Brian Braun-Duin was able to keep himself at 20 life until just now. Steel Leaf Champion bounding into the red zone there will take a big chunk out of BBD's life. Glimmer of Genius.
Oh, I actually love this deck building decision from Brian. A singleton Glimmer of Genius in the sideboard.
Oh, really?
And the reason for something like that is you figure your game 1 plan is very robust and effective against most of the field, but everyone's going to be bringing in their disruption, their duresses, their counterspells, whatever they got to try to shut you down. So having more card drawing in the sideboarded games makes a lot of sense to me.
And here we go, Nissa, Vital Force. Will it stick? From Hans Buckner.
Big moment in this game here.
Torrential Gearhulk from Brian Braun-Duin, disallow.
That's a really strong play from Brian. The only good news, if you're Hans, is that at least it didn't flashback Glimmer of Genius. Funny, it's actually a singleton Glimmer of Genius and a singleton Torrential Gearhulk, and Brian found them both.
And here's Teferi. Will plus, draw a card.
Perfect situation for Brian because he has a 5/6 blocker And even if Hans can somehow force past it, he gets to untap his lands and potentially be ready with something like Seal Away.
Yeah, plenty of cards left in hand, too, for Brian here. And it's a number 2 here from Hans. Says, how about this one?
Wow, super effective against Teferi, super ineffective against Torrential Gearhulk.
You're right, it's making 5/5s.
Hans might just have to attack with both and, sacrifice one of them.
All right,
but it's so bad if Brian has removal and he decides to play it a little safer.
It is still a land there, so we're going to be able to get some elves onto the table, too, for Hans here.
I think if I had been in that situation, I would have attacked with both, just with the thought process of, oh, man, this is so bad for me. If Brian gets to untap with Teferi, I got to take a chance here.
Yeah, Teferi here going to minus down to 2, tuck Nissa back into the library for Hans. Buy himself some more time. Hash up Oasis was the draw here.
And Maria, we did talk about the blue-white control deck having that, well, you could call it a flaw or you could call it a challenge of being very slow to win in Game 1. But Brian actually doing a nice job here. He's got the Gearhulk in play. When he's ready, that can start attacking. He can bring in Lyra Dawnbringer. So the fact that you can win the sideboarded games a little quicker does take a tiny bit of the pressure off.
Yeah, that's a really good point. All right, another pull from tomorrow here from Brian Braun-Duin after we saw Ghalta here from Hans.
So it's all over but the crying at this point. It's, Brian, I'm going to go as far to say he can't lose from this situation with Teferi in play, all his mana, and just having restocked his hand with pull from tomorrow. It's just a matter of him actually going through the motions, eliminating Hans' permanence, getting that Teferi emblem.
Okay, so Brian Braun-Duin going to play out things pretty carefully here, but as you said, resolve just a giant pull from tomorrow. Teferi in play, Torrential Gearhulk in play, the world at his fingertips, as it were.
I suppose I should qualify that. There is a Tyrannosaurus Rex on the opposite side of the battlefield, so that he needs something to answer the 12-12, but there are just so many of those somethings available to him between Fumigate, Settle, and Spot Removal.
And here's one of those somethings right now. Fumigate takes down the crew from Hans Buckner. Resilient Kenra is going to be the play here. And he's just going to have to ship the turn back over to Brian. End of turn here from BBD. Thinking about it a little bit. Let's do a pull from tomorrow again. Why not? For 4. And a land into the yard. Do you ever think to yourself, maybe I should save this pull for when my Teferi is ultimate?
I was going to ask, it would be tempting seeing how that play was so powerful and in fact drew the concession last game, but a lot of playing these control decks in late game situations is you're deciding between, taking lines where you're 99% to win and 98% to win, things like that. So when the situation is so good for you, you want to play for the immediate term, make sure you have all your resources available to you when you need them. And you know what? Once you have the Teferi emblem, you'll find a way. Yeah,
and in fact, BBD is now discarding the hand size. Oof. All right, well, Nissa, here she was. We knew she was going to come back. And he is ready for it with a disallow. Down she goes. Kenra's like, can I get in for 2? No, you certainly cannot. Seal away from Brian. And we are down to a single card in hand, and we know what it is. It is a Ghalta Primal Hunger for Hans. No other creatures on the table. This is just OVER for Hans here in round number 4. All right, the old draw go from white-blue control. Oh, this is interesting. Vraska.
Yeah, probably the best draw in his deck, but it's unlikely to resolve after Brian has drawn so many cards. But there it is.
Oh,
it's certainly possible Brian trimmed some number of his counter spells in the post-sideboard game, given that he doesn't want to bring in his creatures. He wants to have all his anti-creature cards. Something's got to give, and maybe it's a copy or two of Disallow.
All right, so Vraska is going to be good, but it's certainly going to be met with something like a cast out here. Not before it makes a 2/2. Pirate with Menace, and we're going to crack this Memorial to Genius for Brian Braun-Duin. Draw a couple more cards. Teferi takes up, draw again.
Last weekend at Grand Prix Pittsburgh, we watched Mike Sigrist reach the top 8 with blue-white control, really similar deck to what Brian's playing right now. And then he went home and he wrote an article for Channel Fireball with a title of something like, I made top 8 with this deck, but I really hated it.
Yes, it was so great. I love it. Sometimes you just got to be brutally honest. You know, it's not for everyone. Ether Meltdown's going to shrink down this pirate, by the way.
If you're interested in Standard or this deck in particular, you can check out that article by Mike. It's a pretty good rundown of his tournament preparation and experience with blue-white control.
And here's that Lyra that you said you expected him to bring in out of the sideboard. Sure enough, here she is. There's a lot of discussion about this deck, particularly at the Pro Tour, where it really kind of didn't have its moment yet, and how tough it would be, or easy, to play as just a very pure control deck. A lot of players bringing it kind of for the first time that weekend without having played anything like it for a while.
Well, I can tell you, I was on a team preparing for the Pro Tour, and we knew from day one that blue-white was a very strong deck that we should be working on and considering for the Pro Tour. But a lot of us just had the opinion like, oh man, please let there be another choice, because you know, it's not just the mental taxation and how tough it is on yourself to pilot a deck like this through a long tournament. It's also the risk of getting draws. I mean,
right.
If you're playing a deck like blue-white control and 1 out of every 10 matches that you were going to win turns into a draw, that's a huge impact on your chance to do well in a tournament, and that might change, you know, the best deck by a small margin into no longer the best choice to actually pilot in a tournament.
Another Teferi here added to the team for Brian Braun-Duin. Hans has been able to stick a couple of creatures, but we're just going to go ahead and start exiling things, as that is, yes, a Teferi emblem on the table for BBD. Hans is a local guy, wanted to play in Nationals last year, but he couldn't make it to Richmond, so this is his first Nationals, and was very excited to come here and play today. So awesome to see him in the feature match area repping those Lederhosen.
Yeah, he's looking good. I'm happy to see Nationals in a, I guess, a little more centrally located location. We're still, you know, more or less East Coast here, but being more towards the middle of the country, I think, goes with the spirit of the tournament more. Right.
500 Planeswalker points is what you need to qualify for Nationals if you're not a Pro Player Club member. So if you play a couple of GPs and do all right at them, a couple of F&Ms here and there, you're probably qualified. If you want to find out, just out of curiosity, you can always just search Planeswalker points, put in your DCI.
In the very early days of Magic, United States Nationals was one of the more prestigious tournaments that existed.
Oh, really?
I mean, we didn't have the Grand Prix circuit at quite the level that we have now. And United States, of course, being a major hub, the home to a lot of the top players early in Magic, it was highly, highly competitive and highly prestigious for the players that could do well. Still prestigious, still competitive.
Very unique.
There are a lot more tournaments these days, is I guess the point that I'm trying to make. Yeah, unique too. This is a special event, a really fun one, particularly with that split format. We're going to be introducing Booster Draft in a couple of rounds. Hope you'll stay tuned for that.
All right, so the exiling continues here from Brian Braun-Duin, and ooh, attacking with a creature. How dare you, sir? Lyra gets in here for 5.
Hans enjoying his camera time.
Yeah.
Definitely can't blame him.
Sorcerer's Spyglass from Brian Braun-Duin. Why do you think he has that?
He boarded that in because it's great against Heart of Kirin and also insurance against any of the various planeswalkers that Hans might bring in against him.
Sure.
So almost a countermeasure for whatever Hans' countermeasure is. And then, of course, it's got the fallback mode of being a one-for-one answer for Heart of Kirin.
Lyra's going to get the job done, it looks like here. Hans being forced to continually exile, thanks to that Teferi emblem. All right, so he is not throwing in the towel just yet. These Llanowar elves are going to...
So a nice, straightforward 2-0 victory for Brian Braun-Duin. Might even leave him enough time to get a drink of water before the next round starts.
Excellent.
Surely unusual.
That's how you know you're doing control right. I can just get a drink. Hans here, though, gotta appreciate the spirit here in playing it out. And there is the handshake finally. Brian Braun-Duin takes down this match 2-0 over Hans and his Steel Leaf Stompy deck. So congratulations to BBD, who's starting things off at 4-0 here at U.S. Nationals. And we're going to get a chance to talk to him a little bit about his deck. In this matchup, is it just kind of pretty much white-blue's match to lose, essentially?
I think that's a good way to frame it. The thing is that the green Steel Leaf Stompy deck is so punishing if you miss even one step. So it's easy to watch a game like Game 2 there and say, okay, blue-white has all the answers. It's just going to win this matchup. But I think that's not really the case because it only took, one wrong step for Brian, one missed land drop, one missed beat, and he could have got run over by those super hard-hitting creatures. Even after I had effectively called the game, there was a 12-12 trample on the other side.
Yes.
Brian could have just got unlucky with his pull, or Hans could have Blossoming Defense in the perfect spot, and a 12-12 creature does not give you many turns to answer it.
All right, well, we are ready down in the feature match area with our interview. Hi, Maria and Reed hanging out with you here, BBD. How are you doing?
Doing great.
All right, so tell us a little bit about why you chose to bring this monster of a deck to this tournament.
Well, I read Mike Sigrist's article where he talked about how horrible the deck was, so I decided I just had to play it.
Were you playing red last weekend?
I didn't play last weekend, actually, but I did test exclusively red decks for this tournament, and then decided to play this deck without having played it since, 3 or 4 weeks, because I just was not winning with the red decks on Magic Online, so... And I'm really bad at casting Chain Whirler, just really bad at it. So,
Brian, I want to ask you about the card Approach of the Second Sun.
Yeah.
If memory serves, you played Blue-White Approach at the Pro Tour.
I did.
Mike Sigrist recommended in his article that he'd play Approach next time he played the deck, but you don't have it. What's your thought process?
Well, I did play Approach at the Pro Tour, and I did not enjoy playing that card at all. I didn't think it was very good, so I could see it being great if the metagame shifts in different directions, but right now it's just not a card I want to play.
How about the lack of even one single Gideon in your main deck?
Yeah, I think Gideon's kind of a trap for the main deck because it's so hard to ever win a game that way, because your opponent just has all these cards that otherwise do nothing that can interact with Gideon, or random creatures or things like that. It's just kind of a card that's really good in like a couple of matchups and kind of weak in a lot of others. So I'd rather just rely on just 4 Teferis.
So overall, what deck are you hoping to not play against at this tournament? I want to know what deck beats your deck.
I don't know, actually. I'm going to go ahead and say that every deck beats my deck. Depending on how the games go. I don't think that blue-white is like a huge dog to any deck. Like maybe like a black-white deck that's like super aggressive would be a really bad matchup, but that deck doesn't really exist. So out of all the mainstream decks, I don't think that I'm really a dog to anything, but I also don't think I'm great against anything either. So kind of 50-50 Magic being played.
And this build, particularly without any traditional win conditions, for somebody just like interested in perhaps playing it, do you have any pointers for anybody at home?
Yeah, I think it's better to play fast than play perfectly, if that makes sense. I mean, you guys just watched my match, and I did not play perfectly. So I think that, generally speaking, you want to progress the game as fast as you can to make sure that you can finish a match, because draws are often just as bad as losses. So really making sure that you can finish 2 games or 3 games in 50 minutes is pretty important.
Well, you're starting things off strong at this tournament. Best of luck to you the rest of the way, BBD.
Thank you.
Well, that's pretty cool to hear that. You've got to be able to finish your matches, obviously. Play fast. Don't always worry about playing perfectly.
Yeah, some really good advice from Brian. That's the type of mindset you develop when you play as many tournaments as Brian does. It's not just about playing your cards. It's about keeping in mind every factor that contributes to having a good tournament finish.
All right, more from round 4 coming up. Don't go anywhere. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to coverage of U.S. Nationals. Maria Bartholdi and Reed Duke joining you here for a time walk match from round number 4 here in the building. Lovely Columbus, Ohio. Very humid out, though. Very humid out here. But, yeah, we're going to take a look here at Anthony Eason versus Joe Bernal. And what do we have here, Reed?
Well, Anthony with a very predictable deck. This is mono red. Not too many surprises. 23 basic mountains, curving up to Goblin Chain Whirler, Hazoret the Fervent, Rekindling Phoenix. And on the other side, Joe has a pretty unique take on a pretty common color combination. So he's got blue-black, and we know about blue-black mid-range, we know about blue-black control, but Joe is kind of in the middle here with some very interesting card choices. He's got the full 4 Torrential Gearhulk, full 4 Glimmer of Genius.
Oh, wow.
But he's also packing Glint Sleeve Siphoners, and instead of Disallow, he's got softer permission spells, more efficient ones like Supreme Will and Essence Scatter.
Speaking of Supreme Will, there is one right now dealing with one Earthshaker Kenra from Anthony. One is still able to get in there, knocking Joe down to 16 after a couple of hits. Well, that's pretty interesting. It's kind of like he's combining the best of both worlds in a way.
Yeah, I think Joe basically just built a blue-black deck with the cards that he likes and has had good experiences with. So you won't find Champion of Wits. I can definitely see someone, playing with that card and being like, oh, it dies to Chain Whirler. It's not really getting me ahead. I'll cut that, but I'll keep intact the aspects of the deck that I do enjoy, and maybe he's just had a good enough experience with Glint Sleeve Siphoner, likes it enough against blue-white control.
Is there any danger in kind of taking something from over here in the lower end and keeping your high end here and kind of combining them into one instead of streamlining in one direction or the other? There
is. Now, I think when you build a Magic deck, it's important to have a clear plan for how you're going to win games. And if you're going to win every single game with Torrential Gearhulk and the Scarab God, then, what's the point in nickel and diming a couple damage here and there? You're not going to get them to zero with your 2-mana 2/1s, and it doesn't really matter once you control the game whether they're at 14 or whether they're at 20. Now, I think Joe has found the right balance because Glint Sleeve Siphoner, of course, you and I know that it's not really about ticking for 2 damage. It's about getting a proactive early play that can draw you some extra cards and is a must-answer threat for the opponent. And I think, to answer your question, there definitely is a danger, but I think Joe has been pretty careful about his card choices, and everything makes sense to me.
All right, doing well so far. Life total at a 14 here on Crop Crasher. All that's left on the table there for Anthony Eason. Got to give a shout out to the foiling of this mono red deck. And Cast Down will take care of the Crasher here.
Anthony Eason has also competed on the U.S. national team. That was one of the final years of old nationals.
Oh, really?
That he made the top 3, I believe it was, 3rd place and 3rd and 4th playoff.
Nationals brought back in a new way recently. Joe here content to just keep building up mana and passing the turn. And now at the critical 6 here, which we know is very dangerous coming from his deck. How about a little Bomat Courier? And you can see Anthony kind of thinking twice before attacking, but sure enough makes the decision. In hand, I see a Vraska's Contempt, a Cast Down, and a Supreme Will from Joe.
Now, Anthony does have 2 Earthshaker Kenras in his graveyard, so I would have maybe expected him to use his mana on a 6-mana play instead of just the Bomat Courier. However, to unearth a Kenra and attack leaves you just so brutally vulnerable to Torrential Gearhulk that maybe he's electing for something different here. One play he could also have made is to unearth and not attack and just set up for a later moment. But any way you look at this, Anthony's going to be in a bad spot if Joe Bernal has Torrential Gearhulk or finds it here.
Well, he did happen to find it. It's going to take a Glimmer of Genius.
He chose to take Glimmer instead of Torrential Gearhulk. That's
right.
Interesting to me.
Yeah.
it makes sense. You want to see more cards, the game slowing down, and the Gearhulk becomes more powerful after you cast Glimmer. I still think, particularly with the Kenras in the graveyard, I would have picked the Gearhulk.
Lightning Strike going upstairs here from Anthony, knocking Joe down to 11. Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what he gets off of this Glimmer here, from this chain of Glimmers. We're going to take a look at Joe's graveyard here, just to make sure. And here's that play you talked about last turn. Earthshaker Kenra getting eternalized.
Yeah, see, now Joe is in a tough spot here because if Anthony attacks, Joe either taps 4 mana for Vraska's Contempt and doesn't get to cast his Glimmer, or he casts the Glimmer and potentially takes 4 damage in a game where his life total is getting a little bit low. I think it was maybe a bit too fancy to not just take the 6-drop Mythic Rare off his Supreme Will a moment ago. Okay,
so Anthony here assuming that that his creature is going to die, but it's actually a Glimmer of Genius. All right, here we go.
And is Joe doing this before attackers, or is Anthony past the turn without attacking maybe?
And a Supreme Will to dig even deeper here for Joe. Into another Glimmer.
There, I like taking the Glimmer.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, looks like Anthony made the play that I had mentioned. Unearthed the Kenra, didn't attack. So that makes Joe, that gives him a little bit of breathing room, and he's able to spend his mana on the Glimmer comfortably without risking taking damage from Earthshaker Kenra.
Found an Essence Scatter in there as well. So lots of ways to deal with everything that Anthony has going on here. But so far, no other Gearhulk found for Joe.
So if Anthony unearths the other Kenra attacks with both, it's kind of a bad spot for Joe Burnell, but just attacking with one plays into the Vraska's Contempt.
And you're just saying just force more pressure on him?
Well, a lot of times when you face this type of situation, you're playing mono red, there comes a point in the game where you say, you know what, I'm just going to lose if my opponent has the right card.
Right.
Let me take the line that can win if they don't have that particular card. So it's easy for us at home who can see Joe Burnell's hand to say, Anthony should just be playing more aggressively, attacking with everything every turn. But he is really afraid of Torrential Gearhulk, and he wants to navigate to a situation where he doesn't just lose his 4/4 creature to no value. But I think the way the game's playing out, it's going to turn out that he's going to lose even though Joe does not have Torrential Gearhulk.
Right. Liliana Death's Majesty here for Joe. Going to make a zombie.
Okay, so the way that Eason can get back into this game is if Joe taps mana to answer the Kenra, and then Anthony can get Hazoret into play through the Essence Scatter. Even then, it's pretty tough because Joe milled Torrential Gearhulk, and the Liliana -3 can get it back. But whatever happens, the thing that's certain is Anthony Eason needs a big turn.
All right, so this Kenra is just going to be going face here, dropping Joe down to 9. Essence Scatter deals with that Rekindling Phoenix from Eason. And you can see that he just kind of ignored Liliana there on that attack.
Really important card on the battlefield here is that Scavenger Grounds that's sitting on the right side of Anthony Eason's lands. So that means that if Joe was to cast Torrential Gearhulk, Anthony could exile the instant or sorcery that gets targeted. If Joe was to -3 Liliana, Anthony could get rid of the graveyards altogether, make sure nothing bad happened to him.
See an Arguel's Bloodfast at the front of Joe's hand here too, which we saw a lot of last weekend and proved to be super powerful in a lot of our control mirrors we were watching.
Absolutely. And although that card at face value is quite poor against mono red, we also saw the transformed version, the Temple of Aclazotz, contribute to some really amazing comebacks from these blue-black decks.
All right, so take up another zombie here for Joe as he continues to kind of sculpt his hands, and there it is, but only 1 mana up.
Yeah, but a nice convenient turn for Joe. He's able to spend all of his mana and pass with just 1 Fatal Push available and do it all in a way that didn't use the graveyard either against the Scavenger Grounds.
So 1 Earthshaker Kenra in play here for Eason. You mentioned that Scavenger Grounds still on his side of the table as well. He wants to take a peek at Joe's graveyard again, which is getting quite large as Joe kind of rifles his way through his deck here. On 9 life, those activations of the Bloodfast have got to be a little scary, but Fatal Push here on the Kenra. And that is all she wrote for Anthony as he passes the turn back over to Joe, who now has a Torrential Gearhulk in hand as well as a Scarab God.
Yeah, so at this point, it seems Anthony Easton is not going to be able to deal any more combat damage to Joe. Maybe his best chance is just to draw a handful of lightning strikes in a row. But he doesn't have a ton of time to do that in the face of Liliana and potentially the Scarab God coming down.
Is that something you sometimes think about as a red player? I'm just going to save up on these lightning strikes and they won't be able to counter them all?
Definitely. You hear people use the word reach a lot when it comes to red aggro. And basically what they're describing when they say that is the ability to finish off the last few points of your opponent's life total once it gets to this stage where you can't attack anymore. In other words, red is such a particularly strong, aggressive color because it has ways to continue forcing through damage even against the most common defensive measures of most opponents.
Or it just means you can block creatures with flying.
Yes. Also an important use of the word reach.
Soulscar Mage here for Anthony Eason, and there's that Gearhulk that Joe was finally able to find. And Scavenger Grounds is going to activate. So, I mean, can't ask for a much better activation of that Scavenger Grounds.
No, but it's not really addressing the key problem here, which is Joe's increasing army of ground creatures and his 9 points of life remaining.
Yeah, this looks all but sewn up for Joe here, playing blue-black mid-range versus this mono-red aggro deck from Anthony Eason. Just a Soulscar Mage in play. Keeps ticking up this Liliana. Zombies keep being added to the battlefield. And there goes another Scarab God into the yard, and 1 onto the table. Yeah, this is just insurmountable. Well, I do see at least 1 lightning strike, maybe 2 in Eason's hand. I bet he wishes he had some Ramunap runes right now.
Oh, man. It's easy to forget about that card, but we already have a format where mono red is one of the best, if not the best, archetypes, and one of its best cards is on the banned list.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I remember watching so many matchups when in this very situation, it was game over in red 1, thanks to a land.
Oh, wow, and here the Scarab God getting to scry 3 because of the Liliana zombies.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, Anthony Eason's going to pack him up here for game number 1. Let's speed ahead to game number 2. Joe Bernal up a game. Bomac Courier first play here for Anthony Eason gets in for 1, knocking Joe down to 19. Keeping a little card under it in its robot mailbag. And how about 2? Fatal Push is going to deal with one of those. 2 Bomac Couriers. And Cast Down here for the second. How do you like Cast Down in Standard, Reed?
I think it's quite strong. There are plenty of cards that it doesn't answer, but in this blue-black mid-range deck that has plenty of other removal, you can usually find a nice, efficient target for it. Part of a balanced breakfast, in other words. Is if you have a variety of removal, you can line up the right one against the right threat. But the absolute best use of Cast Down is tagging a Glorybringer before it gets to attack.
Right.
Traditionally, for all the years that Glorybringer has been legal, the most common pattern is that you play Glorybringer, you get to attack, kill your opponent's best creature, then they untap and have to answer it. But if you can actually break that holding pattern by killing the Glorybringer the turn it comes into play with an efficient card like Cast Down, you can really increase your chances of beating it.
All right, so Chandra here, attempt number 2 to sticker is good. We're able to cast an Earthshaker Kenra off of it as well. Vraska's Contempt, however, is going to send her to the bin, but that Kenra, a little bit of value. 1 card left in hand for Anthony Eason. And
so Joe had stumbled on mana a moment ago. He missed his land drop, but then he started hitting, and Anthony Eason seems to have the opposite problem, which is that he can't maintain the pressure that he wants because he's drawn too many lands.
yeah, if you're drawing this many lands as a mono-red player, oof. And here's Glorybringer. But it is not going to stick around. Cast Down, just as you mentioned, before any shenanigans can happen. And here's an Essence Extraction as well from Joe. Gain some life, kill that Kenra, and Anthony Eason is out of cards. And Torrential Gearhulk hits the table.
Wow, I thought it was going to be lights out when Joe missed his land drop, but since then Anthony's draws have been somewhat poor, and Joe has definitely found his lands, and now it looks like he's in the driver's seat.
Yeah, Joe was just able to deal with every threat that Anthony presented so far this game. Cycle here, draw some more cards.
By the way, Joe main phased a Torrential Gearhulk
Yes, he
there,
did.
which the outcome was Anthony Eason had to pull the trigger on his Scavenger Grounds, which removed his own Earthshaker Kenra. So really nice job by Joe putting his opponent to the most inconvenient spot he can possibly put him in.
Essence Extraction deals with an on-crop Crasher. Torrential Gearhulk getting in for some beats here, and here's a Scarab God to follow things up. All right, and a Braid here will take care of our Gearhulk.
Well played by Anthony, getting rid of the Gearhulk and then making sure there's no fodder for the Scarab God, but it is not going to be enough.
Joe Bernal takes down that match 2-0 over Anthony Eason. Blue-black mid-range, kind of a unique build there, taking down mono-red. We have more action from U.S. Nationals coming up in just a minute.